Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and today I'm super excited because I'm reviewing a book that hasn't been released yet. What book is it? None other than Frank L. Cole's The Legend of the Last Library. So this book comes out in August, and as of the recording of this video, it is July. And I'm excited to tell you about this book because I want to tell you a couple things about it to set you up for it, because I think some of the marketing made it sound like another kind of book, and I went into it thinking it would be that kind of a book when it was something else that I ended up enjoying. So I thought, I should explain a tiny bit about what kind of book this is. So that way, when you go in to read it, you're not kind of thrown off a little bit like, wait a minute, I thought this was this and it's actually that. What's going on? So let me give you a little background too, because I think what I'm going to explain is going to help you as well going into this story world. No spoilers here. This is a spoiler-free review. I'm giving you information that will help you understand the story a tiny bit and will help you dive into it. So, what is The Legend of the Last Library about? This book is all about a girl named Junie who is what's called a plifter. Plifters are people who search through like rubble and abandoned cities and villages and towns looking for paper. And if they can find a book, that is worth gold, maybe more than gold. Because in this world, in the far future, there are no more books and there's no more paper. All the books and paper have been destroyed. So there's only little fragments left here and there, and when people find it, it's worth a lot of credits. So Junie and her friend Doler and Quays, the three of them are out searching for paper, trying to find any that they can. Now, Junie lives in an area of town called the Mounds, which is kind of like the poorest area in town. These people there don't have any resources. They have like rolling brownouts because there's not a lot of electricity. So it's a really bad place to live. And she's just like scraping by day to day with her grandpa, Edgar. Junie comes to find out that there is something out there called the Last Library. Is it actually real? Or is it not real? And is it actually filled with books? Because if she can find even one of those books, that would set her and her grandpa up for life. And they would be taken care of like forever. So she is trying to solve some clues, find this last library, and hopefully make it out alive. Because here's the twist. Here's the twist. Someone else is on the hunt for the library. And they do not want Junie finding it. Can Junie find the library first, if it's even real? Or will she be stopped by the people that do not want her to find the last library? This book, when I went into it, I kind of thought it would be a little bit of an Indiana Jones, National Treasure vibes, searching for clues, on a quest, solving this clue to lead to that clue kind of a book. Because that's kind of how the marketing set it up. But this is actually a more dystopian sci-fi novel where you have characters using different kinds of technology like a synchron, which is sort of like an earpiece that people put in their ear, and it's sort of like Alexa or Siri in your ear, but has access to more information. So for instance, they can ask the synchron to download a movie or a book. And now what it downloads is not really like a book. It's more like images or ideas or a summary of the book. So they're not really reading any information. It's more like they're hearing all the information instead of reading the information. So the synchron technology is everywhere, and it's used by a company called Novexus, which is pretty much like involved in a lot of aspects of life. So there are like these Nikos, robot dogs that like are kind of like the police that search through the cities to make sure no one's committing any crimes. There's a lot of things going on in the story world. I will admit, in the first 4 chapters, I was a tiny bit lost because there was a lot of information coming at me so fast, so many terms like I've just described to you, like a synchron. There's also an oculus, which is like an eyepiece that allows you to see the different things that your synchron is giving you the information for. So those things are hooked up together to help you the earpiece and the Oculus to help you get the information you need. So these things are kind of coming at you really fast in the first 4 chapters, and it's a tiny bit confusing because I was wondering, like, wait, what's a synchron? What is this about? What's a plifter? So there were a lot of terms that kind of came at you really fast in the middle of some action that's going on. So you have a huge action set piece at the very beginning of this book that just sets this book going. There is a lot of, this is what I call a dread kind of book, where you kind of just have an ominous dread the entire time. Now, I will admit, I did not expect this book to be as dystopian as it was. So think like Hunger Games, Divergent, all those kinds of dystopian sort of stories. This kind of falls in that category, sort of like a City of Ember, that kind of thing. Now, I will admit, I do not always love those kinds of stories because they kind of leave me a little hopeless and a little bit wondering, like, is this actually the fate of humanity? Like, is this actually where we're headed sometimes? I wonder. So it's a little bit of a downer in some spots, but that said, there's a lot of fun adventure here. There's some great action set pieces, and like I said, there is some dread. There is some suspenseful scenes where you are just wondering, how on earth are they going to get out of this? Now, I will admit, Frank Cole, he's really good at setting things up and getting things ready for a final act reveal. And I think there are some good reveals in this story that I thought, oh, that's interesting. And it kind of twisted the narrative around in my head because I thought, well, now that's very different than I thought it was going to be. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here that I think Frank Cole has set up really well. You also have some very typical Frank Cole characters in the sense of he writes pretty humorous characters and comedic characters often. And there are some very comedic characters in this book that just kind of have this little bit of whimsy that reminds me a lot of his fantasy stuff. So you definitely have a lot of those kinds of characters that show up here. You also have an interesting villain, but I feel like there could have been more done with the villain. The villain here, I'm not going to give away who the villain is or what the villain is, but the villain here, I felt like there was a lot of story obviously in the past with this villain. And I thought, oh, I'd actually like to know a lot more about that. And we don't really find out more about it. There's also the ways things are tied up in the end, I think is very satisfying, but also kind of leaves you a little with what happens next. I kind of want to know what happens after this because you've just changed everything with something you did. And now I want to know what's next. So, and this so far is just a standalone novel. It doesn't have a sequel or a series with it. So I'm a little curious if there will be a sequel to this. Like, even if we got one more book, I think to explore some of those things that are talked about throughout this book, but we don't get a lot of information about in this book. So that leads me to the other thing that's kind of interesting about this book is you learn a lot of what's going on in what I call a Hermione Granger kind of way. Now, what I mean by a Hermione Granger kind of way is in the Harry Potter books, whenever they need information, Hermione Granger is always there with a book that she's read, and she tells you all the information you need to know. And we don't always see the things happen that Hermione talks about. We are told those things. So there is an aspect of that in this book, and it makes sense because since we are hundreds of years in the future, there's an aspect of we can't go back in time. We can't really do flashbacks because there's no one who's alive to flash back to. So we're told a lot of information about what has happened in the past. So it's kind of an interesting conundrum where you kind of have to tell that information because you need it for the story world. But it does sometimes seem to slow down the storyline, especially when, and there's a couple times this happens, characters give a little bit of a, we don't have time to talk about that, or let's go to bed, or we're just tired, or I can't handle any more information. So I always kind of don't like when authors do that because it just seems like a cop-out to stretch out the storyline a little longer instead of saying, say what you need to say, get it out there, stay awake for the thing. I just kept thinking, if I was this character being told this information, I would be sitting there saying, I'm not going to sleep until you tell me all of this. So I am staying awake. You're going to tell me all the information because I want to know what's going on. And that doesn't happen always in this book. Now, I do think there's some great character development. And the last thing we do need to talk about is the message of this book. Because this book is a message book. It definitely has something to say. Now, I don't want to super go into it because it would be a spoilery message to talk about. But I will just say this. This book does kind of tackle the book banning and censorship topics that are prevalent today in a lot of places where people are talking about book banning and censorship of books. So I think that it's a very timely topic, and Frank Cole kind of handles it pretty well, but there are some interesting points that he makes where you're left a little unsure of what he's actually trying to say. So I was a little bit thinking the whole time, like, well, what are you exactly saying there? And I think that's not consistent because other places you said this. So I would say go into it knowing that this book has a message a lot stronger than any other Frank Cole book I've ever read. I've never read another book of his that had such a strong message to it. So, in fact, I don't know if I've read another Shadow Mountain book that has this much of a message to it. This is a pretty strong message that's going on here. And I think it's important, and it's definitely a discussion that needs to be had. So go into it knowing that, and knowing that there are some discussions that are happening, especially if you let your kids read this. I would say this is a really good book to have conversations about censorship, about book banning, have conversations about books in general, and like learning and knowledge, I think are very important, as well as like sources of information and where we find information. I think these are all very important topics to have discussions about. And you may find yourself, if you read this yourself, you may find yourself wanting to have some of these discussions with somebody. I know as soon as I finished this, I sat down and I said to my wife, I kind of need to talk about this book a little bit because I have some thoughts about it that are a little bit complicated and I want to talk it out. So we had a long conversation about this book afterwards. So at the end of the day, the question is, do I recommend The Legend of the Last Library? I would give The Legend of the Last Library a 4 out of 5 stars. This was a lot of fun. I think especially if you go in knowing that this is a dystopian novel. It is not an Indiana Jones quest. That's not what this is. This is a dystopian story where you have a lot of heavy things happening in the background. And I think for adults that want to escape when they read middle grade books, this may not be the escape you're looking for. This is more of a dive in to have a deep discussion about really good, relevant topics. So this was a really good book. I think Frank Cole knocked it out of the park once again. It's not my favorite book of his. I really love his fantasy stuff, but I think this is a really interesting new direction for him. And I'm curious if he'll continue in this direction or if he'll do something different. One last thing I gotta say, there is a hidden code in this book. So I'm not gonna say anything about it. It is something for you to discover if you read this book. There's kind of like a little bit of a treasure hunt in this book, and it requires a little bit of legwork. It's not just something you can like, flip through the pages like a 39 Clues book where there's codes in the pages numbers where you can kind of look and see, there's a code down here. Let me just figure that out real fast. This is going to take you a minute. You're going to have to do a little research, and I'm not telling you anything else about it. So it was really interesting to me. So that said, take a look. The Legend of the Last Library comes out in August. Definitely pick this one up if you like Frank Cole. If you like dystopian stories, this is a great one with a really interesting twist on the dystopian genre. I will just add too, This one is very different from dystopian novels I've read before. I've read a lot of dystopian storylines, and this is very, very different from those. I think there's some different elements based on where we are at our current 2024, as of the recording of this video, time frame, where we're having questions about AI and things like that. I think it ties some of those things in, whereas Hunger Games doesn't really do anything with that, and Divergent doesn't really do stuff with that. City of Ember doesn't really do stuff with that. Some other ones, they're very different than this. This book definitely has a different take on the dystopian genre, which I think is really welcome and really fresh. It doesn't feel like, oh, another dystopian book. Okay. It's really different than other dystopian novels that have come before it. So definitely watch for this one. Pick it up when it comes out. And until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye.